We'll start in just a second. Okay, I think everyone's here. Welcome to Politics and Prose Live. We're here tonight with Elizabeth Shackelford in conversation with Elise Labott, and we're going to be talking about her book, The Dissent Channel. And you can purchase The Dissent Channel from Politics and Prose's website. There is a link in the chat, which I've just posted. It's a great way to support our author and to also support your local independent bookstore. Secondly, I'd like to let everyone know that the latter portion of tonight's event will be devoted to your questions. You can ask a question in the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screens. We also have a chat going on, but it's just easier if you all put your questions in the Q&A icon. It just helps compile everything. So with that out of the way, it is my honor to introduce Elizabeth Shackelford. She was a career diplomat in the US State Department until December 2017, when she resigned in protest of the Trump administration. During her tenure with the Foreign Service, Shackelford served in the US embassies in Warsaw, Poland, South Sudan, Somalia, and Washington, D.C. For her work in South Sudan during the outbreak of civil war, Shackelford received the Barbara Watson Award for Consular Excellence, the State Department's highest honor for consular work. Her new book, The Dissent Channel, describes her experience in 2013 in South Sudan during the new country's descent into civil war. Through the lens of South Sudan, Shackelford explores the shortcomings of US foreign policy. She describes how in South Sudan and elsewhere, the US often takes a short-sighted approach that ignores complex situations and does not prioritize human rights. In addition, she discusses how she and other diplomats were hamstrung by an underfunded State Department, eventually leading to her viral resignation letter to Rex Tillerson in 2017. Tonight, Elizabeth will be in conversation with Elise Labott, a journalist covering foreign affairs, most recently as a global affairs correspondent for CNN. I think we're in for a really amazing talk. So Elizabeth and Elise, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
I'm Elise Labott. It's not Labott, it's Labott, but it's okay. It's a thrill to be here with Elizabeth Shackelford with her new book, The Dissent Channel, an American diplomat in a dishonest age. As we said, the link to the book is in the chat, and I'll remind you several other times. But Lizzie, it's really great to be here with you. And, you know, kind of in my wonky world, I was a State Department correspondent and reporter for CNN for almost 20 years. And to be able to talk to a diplomat like you, and also not just about your resignation, which was well publicized, but also in terms of the name of the book, which is called The Dissent Channel, which really goes into, you know, the kind of unique opportunity that State Department diplomats have when they don't agree or they have problems with US foreign policy to make a thoughtful and reasoned explanation of why they don't think it's working. So why don't we just start off with that in terms of why you named the book The Dissent Channel?
Sure, thank you, Elise. You know, it's the Dissent Channel, for those who haven't really heard about it, it's kind of a fabled tool in the State Department. It was first created in 1971 during the Vietnam War, because that was kind of the first time that the State Department had really faced just a tremendous and growing amount of discord inside the department over, you know, official US policy towards Vietnam. And so this tool was established basically to find a way to channel those concerns into an official mechanism. It's a wonderful idea, and I think that it's one that should be, you know, emulated not just by you know, parts of the government, but really any organization should find a way to facilitate conversations about differing points of view. I mean, it helps you to, you know, even if it doesn't change the prevailing opinions and directions of an institution, it helps you kind of you know, hone opinions and, you know, poke holes in challenges and find ways to overcome shortcomings in different policies. Now, the challenge with the Dissent Channel at the State Department, and one of the reasons I named my title my book after that, is that that tool isn't always used in the way that it might have either been intended or is perceived as. You hear about it and you think
it's not a bitching. It's not a tool to bitch.
no,
Not a tool to complain or to leak to the media about that the State Department employees have a problem, which we'll get into later in the discussion. But it's not really a tool for whiners. It's, it gives kind of diplomats as stakeholders in the policy process when, they're not the ones making the policy, but they're the ones kind of carrying it out and implementing it.
Yeah, it's meant. I mean, the way that it should be used is to inform, how high level officials are interpreting and effectively pushing different policies. And I mean, you're not going to go to the trouble as a diplomat to write a dissent channel unless you feel very strongly about the position. I mean, it's pretty rarely used. So rarely that when I first went to inquire in the Secretary's Policy Planning Office about the process, because that's the office that deals with the staffer who'd been there for years was like, I'm supposed to deal with it, but I've not seen one. Let me get back to you. I think you attach it to an email. I don't know. So that was pretty telling for me. But the shortcoming of the dissent channel is kind of I mean, it sounds really boring. The bureaucratic tools that go under it, but it's literally in an official channel that you send it in that nobody can search for, right? About State Department cables, all the reports that come back from the field. Well, if you're dealing with a similar issue or with a country that's dealing with the same issues, you can search in the system and find what people have written as long as you've got the right classification level, clearance level. But the dissent channel is like this hidden little bureaucratic tool where it goes into like this black box that, outside of a tiny group of people, you can't access it. So this whole idea that you can facilitate a broader, more informed conversation doesn't really happen.
Kind of a misnomer. So let's talk about the book. It chronicles your experience as a Foreign Service officer, but you didn't join as kind of a kid fresh out of college. Talk about how you came to decide you wanted to be in the Foreign Service.
So, I came from a different background you get a lot of diversity. That's not the right word for it. You don't get a lot of diversity in the State Department, but you get people who come in from different parts of the country. But a lot of people who come in have some kind of family ties or background in kind of foreign affairs. I was born and raised in Mississippi. I didn't know what a Foreign Service officer was until I was out of college. I knew that foreign policy and diplomacy was a thing, and I studied foreign affairs in college to an extent, but I didn't understand that you could take a test and work your way into, through this kind of civil service system into becoming a career diplomat. I didn't even meet, any diplomats in real life until I was interning. I had a summer internship while I was in law school and I was in Kosovo. And that was the first time I met diplomats in the flesh. And it was primarily a bunch of young guys actually who were on their first tours in Kosovo because it was an unaccompanied post. And it was fascinating. I was like, some of them were quite young. One of them was actually Dave Holmes, who testified in the fall in the impeachment hearings. He's an incredible diplomat, and I met him on his first tour. And to be totally honest, it was watching what he did in Kosovo where I was like, yeah, that's cool. I could do that. But it took me a few more years. I practiced law for a little bit. I was a consultant on USAID projects for Booz Allen Hamilton, where I traveled to about 21 countries, I think, and continue to meet a lot of different US diplomats and USAID personnel. And
kind of caught the bug.
I caught the bug. I was like, these guys are having a cool life. They're doing meaningful work. And I wanted to be part of that kind of civilian army that we sent out there.
So you ended up in South Sudan. You were first in Poland, but Juba really was your dream post.
Yes, people don't really understand why. So when I was in A100, which is the orientation class. It's about 5 weeks long. It shifts every few years. Kind of starting out, that's like your training ground before you get sent as a diplomat out into the world. And I remember chatting with different members of my class over lunch one day, and everybody was saying, we were waiting to get the list, and the list where you propose your top and medium and low ranking choices out of this list of 100 places that you might get sent to. It's really exciting. And most people were looking for something interesting in Europe, a nice place to live.
Right.
And I just knew that, Juba, South Sudan, was where I wanted to go. It was 2010 at the time, and it was still a year away from independence, but it was on that track. I didn't know a ton about South Sudan, but I knew it was on its way to being the world's first country, the world's newest country. And I thought, you can watch, democracy building and state building from the ground up. And that seemed exciting. It seemed an opportunity to do a lot of good. I was still naive, where I just thought we did a lot of good. And it seemed like a unique opportunity. It wasn't even on our list that year. But when I went to bid,
you get this, just to for readers that don't know, when you get a list of open positions, you're allowed to bid on that.
Right. So, and your first 2 tours, and it changes every few years for entry level. But when I was coming in, your first 2 tours, you give them a list of your preferences, whether it's in order or by some kind of ranking, and then they basically ignore those and send you wherever they want to. Needs of the service. Right? Anyone who's been in the Foreign Service will understand that. But Juba, surprisingly, the next time around, I got my first choice. As I found out, it was because nobody else really wanted to go there. Right. But I thought that I'd hit the jackpot.
Yeah, and reading, you write in the book that reading in your welcome package, it was described as, quote, the only time you don't feel sweaty is 5 minutes after you've had a shower, if you even have water. So, I mean, you knew you were going to a pretty primitive place. So, talk about your expectations and how that differed from what you confronted when you arrived.
I'd spent some time before in, a lot of time in different parts of Africa. I'd spent some time in some post-conflict zones, in my various internships and things, but short periods of time. So I thought I knew a lot more than I knew, which is fairly common for folks. But I don't think that the situation on the ground in terms of how we were living and what we had access to and what we didn't was all that different from what I was kind of envisioning in my head. But what was really different was the political and the stability situation. Because I was going in, I arrived in mid 2013, so we were almost exactly 2 years after independence, and the storyline that I was aware of and that I kind of pictured in my head was going to a promising place that was on its way up.
Right.
And that was everything, every story that I'd read into, was saying that. Now, I'd heard from a few, analysts and watchers back in Washington when I was doing my research, it's a little rough over there. But I hadn't heard anything that really comported with how bad the situation is, how tenuous it was, and how close to crumbling the political situation was, and with that, the security situation.
And I mean, just to kind of point out that, South Sudan, the southern part of Sudan, which is kind of more leaning towards East Africa, Christian South, couldn't be more opposite than Sudan, the northern part of the country, which is, kind of more of an Arab Muslim type of, traditions and culture. And
an incredibly historic one.
Right.
Yeah, you look at Juba, and it was a glorified town trying to be a capital. There was, and there still is there's been a lot of building there, with kind of the peace dividends, different, wealthy people invest in hotels and things like that. But it's a glorified town. There are very, very little actual paved roads in the entire country. You go to Khartoum in comparison, and it's been there for a really, really long time. It's a well-developed city. It might be unstable in different ways, but the contrast between the two, couldn't be greater.
And when you arrived there, you write that, kind of what, and you were just saying, like, the history of what you knew about South Sudan and the present, weren't kind of syncing. What does that mean?
It's interesting to look back on the kind of storyline that I thought the reality was, which was this pretty clear-cut good versus evil. Southerners good, Khartoum bad. Southerners are, fighting for their independence.
Why do you think that is?
Why do I think that that's what the story was?
Yes, do you think it had anything to do with, the kind of I feel like what happened, right, was there was this whole celebrity movement about Darfur in Sudan. And then those people just kind of moved over to South Sudan and pushed for the birth of the country as if this was a kind of fait accompli. And of course, they deserve, but didn't really know that much about it.
Yeah, I mean, and it's complicated because it wasn't as though 100% of the Southerners wanted independence. There was a big difference between the people who were pushing for independence and the ones who were really believed that the Civil War was fighting for an equal place in a greater Sudan. John Garang was the kind of touted as the father of independence in South Sudan, and he was the kind of selected leader and was going to lead the country. But about 3 weeks after, I believe it was 3 weeks after the Comprehensive Peace Agreement was concluded in 2005, he was killed in a mysterious helicopter crash. Right. So completely different result, most likely, of the next number of years with South Sudan, because Garang didn't actually support an independent South Sudan. He really just wanted an equal place for Southerners. And in a lot of ways, people to this day ask if that was, if independence really was the best move, given how it's gone subsequently. But it was the celebrity push, it was the evangelical Christian push, right, which was significant lobby in Washington.
I think that's really interesting. Okay, you speak in the book to the deep level of interest that the U.S. government had in South Sudan, but you point out there were no compelling interests there. The nation was kind of really had fatigue after all these years in Iraq and Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. And there's not a lot of strategic importance, but there was this outsized level of interest and support from the White House and Congress. And mm-hmm. Why? Was it really just the evangelical movement? Because you describe in the book the formation of the country as the Cinderella story with the U.S. negotiating the glass slipper.
And there was this huge push by the evangelicals, in bed with in bed is probably the wrong term for the evangelicals. The evangelicals with the human rights community and activists who really wanted to end this war. But you can ask questions about how effective that lobby would have been if the antagonist in this story had not been Khartoum. Because of course you got to think back to this period of time in the 80s and 90s moving up to the buildup of the strong U.S. interest in South Sudan. And Khartoum was a bad actor in our book. We had sanctions against the government. Osama bin Laden had spent years living in Khartoum, and we were upset that he had it as a hideaway there. So I think that really factored into this kind of early stage war on terror interest in keeping Khartoum as a big boogeyman. So that those pieces just fit together like the perfect storm to have us put all of our chips in, behind this idea of independence.
I always kind of felt that the U.S. Was so focused on, giving birth to the nation, but it really wasn't focused on whether the baby was healthy. You know what I'm saying? Yes. I just felt that they weren't paying attention to the foundation and the signs that this was going to quickly be a civil war.
Well, there was so much investment, like political investment in this idea of the independent South Sudan, that there was a reticence to really acknowledge that idea wasn't getting off on a strong foot. But there were also really kind of boring bureaucratic challenges to what you do between 2005 and 2011, which is if they haven't had the referendum yet, wherein the South Sudanese decide to be an independent nation, how do you start building up national institutions? I mean, it's boring, but it's a trip, right? If the United States starts really strongly investing in building up national institutions, or they say it's a fait accompli that independence is going to happen. So there was work on institutions there. I mean, it became that way. But in some ways, that was kind of an excuse to ignore some of the growing pains. I mean, the first couple of, the lead up to the war, really, 2011 to 2013, there was this sense that we had to give the South Sudanese government a bunch of breaks because they were a brand new government. But the truth is they were governing this area for years before independence because they were effectively independent and they'd been governing basically for many years prior to that.
Okay, so let's talk about the situation now. 400,000 dead, about 4.5 million displaced. There's continued retaliatory attacks The country's fractured along ethnic lines, and they're trying to emerge from this civil war. You have close to 7 million people, about half of the population in food insecurity. What is the US getting wrong there? You speak about your disappointment that the US government didn't do more. Why all these years later is this country still not able to kind of stand up?
It's a very fragile place where the country is now. And I think that most informed, observers of the country are not really expecting that the current peace deal is just going to go off without a hitch. I mean, they're already having, they had a lot of violence already this month where government security forces were fighting with civilians that they were trying to disarm as part of the peace agreement. The parliament was supposed to be formed already. It hasn't been. There's been a lot of controversy over appointment of governors. I mean, all of those little mini details are to say that there is a peace agreement that is, kind of barely holding on, and it's reduced the level of violence. It hasn't ended violence. It hasn't brought in all of the opposition groups. But most critically, it hasn't addressed any of the underlying problems that led to the violence, like every peace deal before it.
Now, why don't you speak a little bit about your decision to write a Dissent Channel cable that you sent to the State Department?
So now I have the same concerns with the current peace deal that I had when I first, was watching what was going on with South Sudan, that I had in 2015 when I submitted my Dissent Channel cable. And all of those concerns are that the different efforts at peace are focusing on finding ways to negotiate power between the guys with guns, the governments, and certain relatively powerful rebel leaders. None of these peace agreements have really delved into or tried to address, rampant violence and injustice against civilians, underlying grievances that fuel the exploitation of ethnic tensions. And that's why the place was able to melt into violence so quickly, was because there's all of this anger about a lack of accountability and impunity for violence against different groups that goes back many, many years, into the last 2 civil wars in Sudan. So because of that, any peace you create between these guys at the top is just appeasing certain parties for a little while. It's not actually resolving tension. So that was my issue, is accountability.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about that, process, and did anything come out of it?
It's interesting because it really didn't. It was a cathartic experience for me and a handful of other people who came together to put this dissent in. It put on the record that there was a group of folks who were working on South Sudan who believed that the United States' role in helping promote impunity by a government that was being violent against its own people was helping to maintain a state of war and instability. And after that, it went to an office. We got a nice polite reply 45 days later, which is required under the regulations, and that was it.
You don't think they kind of took it on board, though?
I know they did not take it on board, because I had several conversations with the special envoy and others in the special envoy's office about the dissent.
This Danforth at the time?
No, this was Don Booth.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So, and again, I was treated politely, raising my concerns, but I was told over and over again that the suggestions that we made in the dissent were, utilizing our leverage, following through with an arms embargo, following through with sanctions against people who actually had influence over the situation, removing our tacit approval and kind of political support for a government that was prolonging war. And I was told very politely that if we used the leverage, we would lose the leverage. Because if we used the leverage and it didn't lead to any changes, then we wouldn't have any more leverage to wield in South Sudan. So it was an interesting lesson in how our foreign policy considers the influence of the United States. And my thought was, if the least that we can do is stop being complicit, then we should stop being complicit and take that approval of the government away.
If you're just joining me, I'm with Elizabeth Shackelford. We're talking about her book, The Dissent Channel, An American Diplomat in a Dishonest Age. You can find, it's by Public Affairs publishing firm. You can check out the link and buy the book from Politics and Prose in the chat. We're also going to be taking your questions. If you could put your questions in the Q&A, that just makes them kind of all together. If you want to make some comments in the chat, that's fine. But we'd really like you to put your questions in the Q&A so we have them all together. So you did, I will say though, just to point out that the State Department does have this Dissent Channel, and there are Dissent Awards for diplomats that sometimes those Dissent channels are, I guess it depends on the administration and what the policy is, but they are, I think some of them are taken quite seriously and do, and sometimes do affect change. And that's when there are these Dissent Awards that are given out to
You know what's interesting about the Dissent Awards? If you go back through over the past, I mean, you can go back and look at the American Foreign Service Association,
yeah, right, the American Foreign Service Association.
You can go through their website and read past information on who gets the Dissent Awards. Dissent Channel cables and memos are so rare that the vast majority of the Dissent Awards are not for dissent cables. In fact, they're not actually for dissent. They are usually given to individuals who, I mean, do great work at changing protocols and processes, but it is usually someone who has found a mistake in the system or something that's not particularly effective, and they've gotten support from the people above them to push for that change. So it's not typically someone who says, I mean, to be fair, I write about this in the book. My co-author on the dissent cable for South Sudan wrote back to me after we'd submitted it, and I was very anxious about the reply. And he said, I highly doubt that any dissent cable has made it up to the front office and they've said, we've been getting this wrong all along. I think we're just gonna flip it.
In there, yeah. So when President Trump took office, very notably, about more than 1,000 diplomats signed a dissent cable about the travel ban, which I really think, I'm not really sure that's what as we were talking about in the beginning of the discussion, I'm not really sure that was what the cable, that's not what this particular channel is meant to do. And you write in the book that you didn't feel that would be helpful and was misplaced.
Yeah, and I got a lot of questions from friends and colleagues about, should we sign on? You've gone through the Dissent Channel process. What do you think about signing on to this cable? And at the time, we knew it was going to get leaked. It was getting spread around so far and wide. And my thought, I was really torn. I mean, I fully understood why people wanted to speak out and why it would likely end up getting, being made public and leaking. But for me, the interesting part was that the Dissent Channel is about changing policy in the State Department, and everybody's superiors up until the very top agreed that the travel ban was a terrible idea for national security and for our foreign policy. So it felt like it wasn't the right mechanism for that reason. But my biggest concern was that in leaking it, you kind of, and again, I understand why that happened, and I'm not opposed to the fact that it did, but it kind of undermined the sense that we had this tool that we're supposed to use to make change from the inside. I have personal experience knowing that the mechanism doesn't work right now for change from the inside. But I think that there are ways to improve it. And actually, back in the 1970s, in the early days of the Dissent Channel, they had this open forum where they actually brought people together to talk about these controversial issues in places where people wanted change. And that got lost along the way, quite a long time ago, I think by the 90s. And I wonder if that's the kind of thing that, maybe in a new administration, when we see that there's this need to rebuild an opportunity for people to speak up, is that the kind of tool that might better facilitate it so that you're able to do it on the inside without having to leak it to the outside to have any impact?
Well, I certainly don't think in this administration, and certainly not with Secretary Pompeo, that there is really that kind of constructive discussion between the diplomats and and the front office, or the seventh floor, as we like to say, where the secretary and the top officials are. So you resigned. You wrote a very public resignation letter. Before we get to the letter itself, why don't you talk about what it was that led you to resign?
So, yeah, I mean, I have at this stage written an entire book about disagreeing with policy that primarily happened under the Obama administration. So it's certainly not that, it was enough for me simply to disagree with our policy to leave, because I understood that, you work your way up through the system, you learn how to be more influential, and over time you help make change. And that was my hope when I stayed in, regardless of really disagreeing with policies in certain places. It was not because there was a change in administration, it was not for a partisan reason, but it was because I no longer felt that I had the same interests in ultimate goals that the leadership, both in the White House and in the State Department, had. I felt as though our leadership had diverged dramatically from, the real purpose and goals of the State Department. How can you make change from the inside if you don't have the same ultimate goals or values? So for me, that was the real difference. And, it wasn't one single thing where I woke up one day, saw the news and said, I'm done. It was a combination. It was death by 1,000 cuts. It was, Secretary Tillerson's, very open and public and frequent dismissal of human rights, saying that they often got in the way of, real priorities. It was the travel ban, because at the time I was working, at the U.S. mission to Somalia, and that was one of the target countries. And it had no benefit to our security because it was already incredibly difficult for people to get a visa. It was just a slap in the face to counterterrorism partners that we had been trying to work with, and frankly made it difficult for our own Somali employees to go and get training and that type of thing. It was a lot of the language that was being used by the highest levels of our government that othered different people, and knowing that we were in a position where that could foment instability in our own country and in others. It was, the use of, terms that, kind of fed into our enemies' narratives, the gutting of terminology in reports just to appease, whether it was Tillerson or Trump or, it was all of those things that convinced me that we were not fighting for the same goals. And it's a hard job. Why would you do that when you can't achieve something?
So you, a year into the administration, after 8 years in the Foreign Service, is that right? You resigned, and let me just quote a little from your letter. Over the past 10 months, our government has failed to demonstrate a commitment to promoting and defending human rights and democracy. President Trump's dismissive attitude towards human rights was no surprise following his campaign, but your Secretary Tillerson's May 3rd remarks to State Department staff shocked many, as you called into question the utility of advancing human rights when it proves inconvenient. As a foreign policy professional, I understand better that we must balance competing interests, but human rights and democracy are fundamental elements of a safer world for people. And you kind of recommended that Secretary Tillerson resign as well, which didn't go over that well. But I think Secretary Tillerson himself, it's pretty obvious that he was a fish out of water in this job. But I think he also, while he tried to execute this President Trump's foreign policy, I think he might have not had problems with the administrative part. And we can talk about the gutting of the State Department and of the Foreign Service. But I think on the diplomacy part, he had some problems with the diplomacy.
Yes, Secretary Tillerson had a number of problems. He didn't have a great relationship with the White House, which, can be very undermining to your effectiveness. I do believe that he was less nefarious on foreign policy. I think that he did see the destabilizing factors of a lot of what was coming out of the White House. But for me, what was really, I didn't blame him so much for those positions. They're different from mine. I have more progressive positions in areas like human rights. He had a different worldview. It was that of a businessman, from the fossil fuel industry. But his foreign policy views were at least rational to that background. You could kind of understand what drove him in different directions, which I cannot say for Trump or frankly Pompeo most of the time, who I believe has a domestic audience. But what was so damaging about the tenure of Tillerson was his administrative actions towards the department itself.
Right.
And I am convinced that they were not done to make us more effective. I am convinced that they were done to make us less effective in standing in the way of priorities that he had as a businessman who did not like, values in our foreign policy to stand in the way of his profit.
Well, I mean, look at the State Department today. I mean, we've had so much institutional knowledge out the door, whether it was like people left, they were fired, they were redundant, they retired. There's the State Department now, the Foreign Service is really a shell of what it was. And not only do you not have that top rung of diplomats, but you also, I feel like you don't have that medium rung that is supposed to kind of go up to leadership, and you don't have anyone to mentor the younger people who are joining now. I know recruitment is down. What advice do you have for people who are thinking of joining the Foreign Service?
First I'd like to give a shout out to the folks who still are there. And I have so many friends and colleagues who remain. A lot of people did leave, but a lot of people have stayed behind. And, for the ones who are able to continue, to kind of quietly stay under the radar and, push forward programs and policies that do benefit the American people, I applaud them for putting up with a lot of BS, frankly, and poor treatment and dismissive attitude from and proper attacks from the administration and their own leadership. So I do want to say that there will be people who are there, they're waiting in the wings, and I'm grateful for that. But it has been seriously handicapped. There have been a lot of departures, particularly people at the higher levels, and of a lot of our diversity in the middle levels. I mean, anecdotally, and this is all that I have, but anecdotally, every mid-level person who I know who has resigned has been a person of color, a woman, or both. And I don't think that that's a coincidence. I think that is, kind of
real initiative now to kind of deal with that lack of diversity in the state.
There really is a lack of initiative. And if you are a woman or person of color trying to represent these policies overseas, which are harmful to minority groups, people of color, and of women now, because of how many programs have been and initiatives on the gender and diversity side have been pushed out. I mean, it's properly embarrassing to be out there, as a Black woman representing the United States right now. I mean, I have friends who have been laughed at by counterparts in other countries, and that's a horrible thing to try and endure. So I think it makes it harder for them to stick it out. So at the end, you're going to see the results of that in a less diverse department.
Yeah. Also, I mean, I feel like this White House is kind of treating the State Department and even the Secretary of State. I'll never forget when President Trump kind of said something negative about the State Department in front of Secretary Pompeo, and he just laughed. And I mean, I know, okay, he was nervous, but he's not, I feel like he's even more than Tillerson, this Secretary of State.
He doesn't have their back.
Not had the back of the department. And whether that's Marie Yovanovitch, the ambassador to Ukraine that President Trump fired, or some of the other employees that stood up, or other employees that were let go or penalized for their, I can't even say political support of President Obama. It's really just they call them holdovers. We call them career diplomats.
Exactly.
And I feel like this whole thing of the deep state, I think we need to flip it, because the deep state is people who are deeply patriotic to the state.
Right.
Not to one man. So I mean, the people that are staying in are doing yeoman's work. Let's go to some questions. Again, if you're just joining us, I'm with Elizabeth Shackelford with her book, The Dissent Channel, An American Diplomat in a Dishonest Age. The link to buy the book is in the chat. And we have a bunch of questions that we're going to go to now. And if you have a question, you can put it in the Q&A function. Stephen asks, what is your take on why countries, quote, can't seem to get it together? Is it geography, legacy, or of colonialism, too many problems being preyed upon by larger, richer countries, lack of investment in their people, lack of access to capital? Your thoughts? I would say yes.
Yes. Yes, all of those. I mean, all of those are factors. And, I think that we do a pretty poor job in the diplomacy and development world and with our military of assessing what the knock-on effects, the second and third order effects are of assistance and different aspects of our partnerships. I don't think that we really analyze the unintended negative consequences. A big part of that is corruption. Corruption is a massive hindrance to development and progress in a lot of these countries, South Sudan among them. And when you have, let's say, a war ends or peace is declared, and there's often an interest by donors to come in rapidly and pour money in, and they come in their armies of white Toyota SUVs with gobs of money. They hire everybody up, from different kind of private and public sector jobs. They pay better, so all of a sudden, your private healthcare system, your private education system, a lot of government officials, everybody who has ability and capacity goes to these high-paying jobs with donors. And this is just one little example of how we don't really think through what that does to gut the capacity in other areas. You look at programs that have been largely successful for lifting up different countries in different ways. A big one that's often touted is the PEPFAR program, on the Presidential Initiative to Address AIDS. And that was really successful, right, by President Bush. One of the most successful initiatives on the African continent from a development point of view. But it also stole everybody from private sector healthcare. And you're giving away in one part of the capital city, you're giving away vaccines. So the healthcare clinic, that's private because the government's not providing anything, that's across, a few streets away, suddenly has no business. They go out of business. When the money dries up from donors, poof, you have no healthcare system left behind. So, on the development side, people are starting to figure out how to try and pay attention to that. But we have a legacy of decades of pouring money into places without really accounting for the damage that it can do in addition to the short-term goals. So, I think that it's, corruption is a huge problem and it's very difficult to address. I do think the legacy of colonialism is very real and very there, because you have governments that kind of took over these, kind of corrupt governance systems that fed the central government rather than providing services to the people. And that government it's a little bit like spending your money at the Walmart so that it goes back to to the headquarters and doesn't really help the community around it. And that was really kind of the governance structure that a lot of these countries inherited after independence. So the long story short there, though, is that these are issues that take real long-term dedication and political will to address. There's progress in some places, but it's slow and it's hard.
Anonymous question. Would you consider going back into the Foreign Service if Biden wins and appoints a highly competent Secretary of State?
It's a question I ask myself often. I'm going to continue to find whatever way I can help contribute to a broader conversation. If that is, under a very effective Secretary of State back in a new administration, I would certainly consider it. But for now, I think it's really important to help inform the American public about how important what we do overseas is and how important it is that we learn to do it better in the name of the American people. So, as long as I have a platform to speak to more people about what happens in foreign policy, that's something that I think is important to do as well. But yes, I'd consider all things.
From your colleagues who remain behind despite Trump administration dismissal of human rights, what pieces of the mission do they hold on to? It sounds like a tough decision either way.
It is a really tough decision. And I've had this conversation with many former colleagues. I think that people have asked my advice as well as somebody who's left, what would I do if I were still on the inside? And I think it's an individual question for everyone, not just in the State Department, but in any aspect of this federal government. I think that it's important to consider what your job is every day. And are you every day able to continue to push your mission forward, to continue to promote things that are in the US national security interest and that bring greater stability and prosperity in other countries that we rely on and are trying to help? And if you can do that without accidentally or inadvertently, promoting dangerous policies, then by all means stay stay on the course, if you can keep your, your head down and stay under the radar and do good things, maybe without the administration realizing that you're still doing that, then do it. But I do think that everybody needs to analyze every day whether or not their day-to-day actions might inadvertently be promoting dangerous policies. And if you're in a position where that is happening, then I think that it's incumbent upon you to either speak out or leave. So I think people who can still see little positive aspects of their job are able to continue getting that sense of success out of it.
A couple of people have said, the problem is Trump himself. Do you agree that that's, I feel like they think that a lot of people think it's a ding dong, the witch is dead. And once Trump is gone, we're going to go back. I'm not so sure.
No, I think that Trump is a big problem and Pompeo is a big problem, but they've been able to exploit some weaknesses in the system. And that's why they've been so effective at damaging our foreign policy and damaging the State Department. So, the problems with the State Department long preceded this administration. Number one is—
You write about that in the book. You say, this kind of preponderance of aid towards the military, the State Department's always been the kind of stepchild, which I think, especially at 9/11 and since then with the counterterrorism, that's been a real factor. Right.
It's a huge factor. And if we're not able to rebalance and rejigger our foreign policy to put civilian leadership in the lead, we're in this situation where our front forward face to the world really is clad in camouflage and armed. And we've got 800 locations of bases where we have military across the globe, which it outshines anybody in terms of military presence around the globe. And it makes our interactions more militant as well. So I think that, it's not going to be enough to go back to status quo ante 2016. If we do that, we retain these weak points in our foreign policy. But I think that a changed administration at this point, because of how much has been burned to the ground, is going to have a tremendous opportunity to really start fresh and make some necessary changes.
If the Dissent Channel doesn't work to give feedback to correct policy mistakes, what, if anything, does?
That's a good question. I think one of the biggest problems, and this goes back to the issue of our foreign policy having long-term problems, is it's very inertia driven. It's hard to steer us in a different direction when we're already on course. Part of that is the political cycle and the increasing number of political appointees that are taking over, what previously were career positions throughout the State Department. If you're in a 4-year cycle, you're looking for quick wins, you're looking for short-term results, you're not focused on what's happening 15 and 20 years out in any particular location. So, I think that there are ways to address it, but I think that first of all, it requires that we depoliticize our foreign policy. That's going to be the first step. And I do think that there are some kind of boring bureaucratic changes you can make to the Dissent Channel process that can really facilitate a more robust conversation about, where should we make changes? How will we do that? What are the shortcomings to these policies?
From one question, do you agree with Dambisa Moyo's book, Dead Aid? That was a good book. Why aid is not working and how is there a better way for Africa?
Oh, I read that book years ago, but I do remember it had some really, it was quite accurate in a number of places. So yes, I think that she hit the nail on the head. And it's important to hear from people outside the American and Western think tank world to learn more about why these things don't work. And that's just a great example of how we need more voices in countries that are affected by what we do elsewhere. We need to reflect on what the impact is in the places where we are rather than just at home.
Well, and I think also kind of dealing with countries and having them lead, we have danger of this in Africa, which is like, it's aid that's given, it's not sustainable aid, but it's the same thing in a country like Afghanistan. We spent billions of dollars on these reconstruction projects that were not led by Afghans, and then they weren't able to kind of absorb them and stand up. So we're just a lot of times we're throwing money at these countries without asking them what they need, what they want, and how we can help them help themselves, as opposed to, the whole idea of trade, not aid.
I'd say the development world has learned those lessons the hard way. And over the past, number of years, they've put a lot more monitoring and evaluation into their programs. They've put a lot more effort to, kind of best practices where you bring in the planning stage and process, you bring in the local stakeholders, you bring in the government into the discussion, you try and get the buy-in. Again, these are kind of, consultancy, difficult bureaucratic procedures that aren't that interesting to average everyday Americans, but, and they create really slow projects. But I applaud the effort, because if you look on the military side, for example, we don't have nearly the same requirements of monitoring, evaluation, and learning along the way. We're expending millions and millions and millions of dollars in so many countries. We should know if it's working. So I think that right now the development world, the USAID world in particular, is in a tricky place where people are critical of how slow things go. But I think that they're navigating a path towards more accountable assistance, and I think that's really important.
That book, Dead Aid, Politics and Prose, has generously put that link in the chat. It's for anybody that's interested in Africa and how aid is delivered and used. It's an older book, but it's a great book. And definitely for anyone interested in the field, I recommend it, along with the Dissent Channel. That is also in the chat. So what are you doing now? And another question is, how do you talk to potential employees about why you left state? Interview experts say you shouldn't speak ill of your last employer, but how could you not?
That's a really good question. I've mostly avoided the question by avoiding employment. I didn't leave with like a big plan of what I was going to do. And I decided that I was going to try and spend time between when I resigned at the end of 2017 and 2020, trying to find ways to help bring change to our political system because of how important it is to our governance system. So I've done a lot of volunteering, as everyone should do. We're in that last stretch before the election, so do what you can to help get out the vote. Write postcards, don't knock doors now, dangerous, but write postcards, make phone calls, donate. So I've been doing a lot of that at a local level and in national areas. And I do some consulting on issues related to things that I used to do, trying to help promote better approaches to counterterrorism and our foreign policy generally. So I'm writing, I'm thinking, I'm taking some time to do that. We'll see what happens next. But for future employees, I don't know.
So, I mean, but it's true. Like if someone Googles your name, like, I'm tweeted about Syrian refugees, and now every time someone, and got suspended from CNN for that. And every time someone Googles my name, Elise Labott got suspended for defending Syrian refugees. So I know that, a decision like that, especially in the internet age, kind of lives with you. How do you navigate that?
It probably helped that I didn't think that there was any chance that my resignation letter was going to go viral like that. But since then, I've learned that when you put things in print in any form, it lives with you forever. So, you have to put things out there that you'll be willing to live with in 10 years. And that's hard. But if you know that you've held those positions for
employees how do you talk to potential employers about it?
Well, I mean, you stand on the principle, right? I mean, if you did something for the right reasons, and quite frankly, I'm never going to be a cookie cutter employee. I learned that at State. I loved a lot of aspects about that career, but I was not exactly your kind of easiest get along diplomat. So I think you just have to accept that if you have that type of approach and attitude, people either appreciate it and think it's going to really bring something to an organization or an institution, or they don't. And if they don't, then that's probably not the right place for me to be.
So whose job is it to make the reforms for the State Department such that the Dissent Channel works? Is it to limit the number, do you think, of political appointees, or change incentive?
Yeah, I think that there are many things that can be done both within the State Department. There are loads of different initiatives right now to assess what's going on with the State Department and how to build it back better. Different think tanks and academic groups are looking into that. So I believe that it's going to be very important to make changes within the institution. But I also think that Congress has a role to play in its oversight role and its legislative role. It's been a very long time since the kind of overall governing law of the State Department has gotten totally revamped, or the Foreign Service Act is very outdated. So these are things that can be legislated. Issues like political appointments, it was a norm. Like so many other things, we relied on a norm that you just don't appoint too many. That you kind of keep it under a third of your political appointee ambassadors. And
growing
and
for
if,
many years though, so it's
right.
I don't think that's indigenous to Trump, but
No,
certainly.
it's exactly. It's been growing and growing. And as long as it was growing quietly, people were like, it's fine. But now it's, as with many other things with this administration, they've taken small problems and they've
Right.
spelled them out to like their extreme level. So I think things like that are going to have to be legislated.
Do you see a role for the Peace Corps in? We have a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to give you a couple, and then we'll kind of wrap it up. Do you see a role for the Peace Corps in Sudan? And what is your advice for this year's A100 class?
Well, I'll start with Peace Corps. The Peace Corps is such a great program for our image in the world. I mean, in so many remote places that I've traveled, across Africa and elsewhere, I have found people who are like, hey, random person in our village, you must be with the Peace Corps. We love the Peace Corps. That sounds absurd, but the message really is that they see that as a positive delivery from the United States. And I think that's a much better image for people to have in different countries than military and drones. So I certainly support that, at a time when it can be safe. In terms of the advice for the incoming A100 classes this year, it's a really great career. And if there is a change in government, it's you're going to have this incredible opportunity. You're going to be able to move up quicker than people in my A100 class were, because there's a need. And it's incredibly important, the work that we do out there. You can just look at the work during the earlier stages of COVID at what 100,000 Americans were brought home by the hard work of foreign service officers. So I would just say keep the faith, but maintain your own standards and character, and always be asking if what you're doing day to day is helping or hurting the cause.
I'm going to bring this back to the A100 class. One of the questioners said, it seems to me the author is still naive. She said Juba was good and Khartoum was evil. It can't be that simple. I think you said that the storyline that you thought you were going into was that Juba was good.
That was not the case.
So when you talk to someone who's going out to these posts for the first or second time, and they're young and they're idealistic, what have you learned in 8 years in the Foreign Service about kind of, preconceived notions and expectations, and kind of then going there and living it and breathing it?
I think it's a really important point to raise, that there are never two clear signs. There is never one that's wholly good and one that's wholly evil. There are always different incentives and drivers for conflict, whether it's physical violent conflict or political conflict. So it's important to always look at your counterparts and at different players in conflicts as humans who are experiencing life and trying to get the best for their own people. If you can better understand what drives people, whether this is in counterterrorism situations or in political negotiations, if you can better understand what drives people, you can better, reach and resolve conflicts and reach solutions. So never make assumptions, and don't, always question the storylines that you're told, particularly if they seem overly simplified.
Well, last time, the book is called The Dissent Channel, An American Diplomat in a Dishonest Age. The link is in the chat from Politics and Prose. I'd like to thank Lizzie Shackelford, and thank you to Politics and Prose for this discussion, for keeping us. Politics and Prose events in Washington have been a kind of institution, and I'm glad that we're able to keep it. It's not the same in the age of COVID when we can all meet at Politics and Prose and then have a drink after, but certainly this is really great that they're keeping it going for us and keeping us able to hear from and learn about wonderful books and writers like Lizzie and like this book. So thanks to all of you for joining in. I know there's some more events tonight with Politics and Prose, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.